The silence that followed Simi's departure was not the peaceful quiet Tunde had expected. It was a loud, throbbing void that echoed in every corner of the Adeleke mansion. Simi had left within the hour, carrying only the small suitcase she had arrived with 3 years ago. She didn't ask for money, and she didn't take the jewelry Tunde had bought her after the wedding. She simply vanished into the humid Lagos night, leaving the gold wedding band on the marble countertop. Tunde spent the first night in a fit of rage. He felt like a pawn in a game played by a woman he had worshipped. Nneka, the pillar of his life, had treated him like a character in one of her legal briefs, moved and manipulated for a desired outcome. He stayed in the study, surrounded by the scent of spilled tea and the cold reality of the DNA test. But by the second night, curiosity began to override his anger. He went back to the mahogany box. Beneath where the scorched teddy bear had sat, there was a false bottom. He pried it open with a letter opener, revealing a stack of 10 envelopes, each numbered in Nneka's elegant cursive script. He opened the first one. "My dearest Tunde," the letter began. "If you are reading this, you are likely furious. You are probably looking at Simi or the space where she used to be, with a heart full of betrayal. You think I used you, and in a way I did, but I didn't use you because I didn't love you. I used you because I knew your heart was the only place safe enough for my sister's broken life." Tunde sank into his chair, his eyes blurring. "When I found Simi at that roadside buka in Obalende, I didn't see a maid. I saw the eyes of our mother. I saw the little girl I had accidentally let go of during the chaos of the fire 20 years ago. I spent thousands on private investigators to track her down, and when I found her, she was a shell. Life had been cruel to her, Tunde. She had been abused, discarded, and forgotten. I couldn't just announce her as my sister. The scandal would have ruined my firm, and more importantly, the sharks in our social circle would have torn her apart." Tunde turned the page, his heart heavy. "I brought her into our home as a maid to observe her, to see if she was still the sweet soul I remembered, and I saw how she looked at you, not with lust, but with the same quiet steadiness that I fell in love with. I am dying, Tunde. My biggest fear isn't death. It's that Simi will fall back into the cracks of the world, and that you will grow old and bitter in this big, empty house. You both need a family. You both need a reason to stay soft." Tunde stopped reading. He looked at the scorched teddy bear. He remembered Nneka mentioning a fire once, but she had always claimed she was alone when it happened. She had carried the guilt of losing her sister for 2 decades, a secret she never shared with him. He spent the next 3 days reading the letters. They were a road map of Nneka's heart. She detailed Simi's favorite things, how she loved the smell of rain on hot asphalt, how she secretly practiced her handwriting at night, and how she had once saved enough of her maid's salary to buy Tunde a birthday gift, but was too afraid to give it to him. On the 4th day, Tunde called his driver. "Find her," he commanded. "Check the shelters. Check the old neighborhoods. I don't care how much it costs. Find Simi." But Simi didn't want to be found. She had retreated into the vast, anonymous sprawl of the city. She was working at a small laundry shop on the mainland, scrubbing stains out of shirts for people who didn't know her name. She had changed her phone number and moved into a tiny one-room apartment that smelled of damp concrete and detergent. She sat on her thin mattress one evening, clutching the scorched teddy bear she had snatched back before leaving the mansion. She felt a strange sense of relief. The secret was out. She was no longer a madam living a lie, but she was also no longer a sister. She was just Simi again. One afternoon, as she was hanging damp sheets on a line behind the laundry shop, a sleek black car pulled up. It was out of place in this neighborhood of crumbling brick and open gutters. Tunde stepped out, looking thinner, his eyes shadowed with lack of sleep. Simi froze, a wet sheet halfway to the line. "How did you find me?" Tunde said softly, walking toward her. You forgot that I'm an architect, Simi. I know how people move through spaces, and you always did have a preference for being near the water. He gestured to the nearby lagoon. Go home, Tunde, Simi said, turning back to the laundry. The marriage was a mistake. Ineka is gone. You don't owe her anything anymore. I'm not here because of a promise to Ineka, Tunde fed, stopping just a few feet away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold wedding band. I'm here because I realized that for 3 years you were the soul of my house, and for 3 months you were the only thing that made me feel like I wasn't living in a graveyard. I don't care who your people are. I don't care about the scandal. You're just lonely, she whispered, her back still to him. I am, he admitted, but I'm also curious. I want to know the girl who survived the fire. I want to know my wife's sister, and I want to know if the woman who hums that lullaby can ever forgive a man for being too blind to see the queen standing in his kitchen. Simi turned around, her eyes brimming with tears. For the first time, she didn't look like a maid or a socialite. She looked like a woman who was finally being seen. But as Tunde reached out his hand, a phone rang. It wasn't his. It was Simi's old phone, the one she thought she had deactivated. A message flashed on the screen from an unknown number. I know who you really are, Simi Olesia, and I know what Ineka did to get you that mansion. If you don't want the police to hear about the accident that killed your parents, meet me tonight. The suspense in the air turned cold. Tunde saw the look of pure terror on Simi's face. The secret was out, but it seemed the past wasn't done with them yet. The damp air of the mainland laundry shop suddenly felt freezing. Simi stared at the glowing screen of her old phone, her breath hitching in her throat. Tunde noticed the sudden drain of color from her face and reached out, steadying her by the elbows. Simi, what is it? She couldn't speak. She simply handed him the phone. Tunde read the message, his brow furrowing into a deep, angry V. The accident? What is this person talking about? The fire was 20 years ago. Simi sank onto a plastic crate, her legs giving way. The fire. It wasn't just a kitchen accident, Tunde. My father was a man who owed people money, dangerous people. But the police closed the case because they said it was a faulty gas connection. If someone is bringing this up now, it's a shakedown, Tunde snapped, his protective instincts flaring. They see you've married into the Adeleke name, and they want a piece of the pie. Who else knew the truth? Simi shook her head. Only Neka and Mr. Bankole, but Bankole is a man of honor. He wouldn't. We're going to find out, Tunde said, his voice firm. But not here. This place isn't safe. You're coming back to the house, not as a maid and not as a ghost. You're coming back as my wife, and we are going to face this together. Returning to the mansion felt different this time. The staff looked at Simi with a new kind of reverence, having heard whispers of the DNA results. Tunde led her straight to the study. He didn't pour whiskey this time. He poured 2 glasses of water and sat across from her. Tell me everything, he commanded. Not what Neka wrote in her letters. Tell me what you remember. Simi took a shaky sip. I was 6. Neka, her real name was Amaka then, was 10. Our father had a bakery on the ground floor of our apartment building. He was a proud man, but the economy was failing. He took a loan from a community union that turned out to be a front for a local gang. The night of the fire, I remember hearing men shouting downstairs. Then there was the smell of petrol, not gas, petrol. She closed her eyes, the memory vivid as a fresh wound. Amaka grabbed my hand. We ran for the back stairs, but the smoke was so thick. There was an explosion. I fell, and my hand slipped from hers. I crawled into a storage cupboard. I thought I was going to die. When the firemen found me, they took me to a different hospital than her. By the time I was discharged, she was gone. I spent the next 15 years moving from one overcrowded foster home to another, while she became the Neka you knew." "And the blackmailer?" Tunde asked. "The message said, 'the accident that killed your parents.' If it wasn't an accident, and if there's proof that it was arson, and if Neka knew—" Simi's voice trailed off. The meeting was set for 11 p.m. at a deserted construction site near the Echo Atlantic project, a place of half-finished dreams and towering cranes. Tunde insisted on going, despite Simi's protests. He brought no weapons, only his phone and the weight of his name. When they arrived, the sea breeze was whipping through the skeletal structures of the buildings. A lone figure stood under a temporary floodlight. As they approached, the figure stepped forward, and the light revealed a face that made Tunde's heart stop. It was Kunle, Neka's former driver, a man who had been with the family for 8 years, a silent witness to every conversation, every doctor's visit, and every tear Neka had shed in the back of the car. "Kunle," Tunde breathed. "You? I treated you like a brother." "A brother? You treated me like a steering wheel, Mr. Tunde, and Madame. I drove her to the DNA clinic. I drove her to the slums to find this girl. I heard her crying on the phone to Mr. Bankole about the blood money that started her career." "Blood money?" Simi stepped forward, her fear replaced by a cold clarity. "Yes," Kunle spat. "Your sister didn't just get adopted by chance. The man who adopted her was the one who ordered the fire. He felt guilty after your parents died, so he took in the bright one. Neka found out 2 years ago. She realized her whole life, her education, her law firm, her status, was paid for by the man who murdered her father. She didn't find you out of love alone, Simi. She found you because she was trying to pay back a debt that could never be settled." Simi felt as if the earth had opened. Neka's dying wish wasn't just about love. It was an act of penance. She had married Simi to Tunde to ensure that the Adeleke fortune, which had merged with her own blood money through their marriage, would finally belong to the sister who had lost everything. "I want 50 million naira," Kunle said, holding up a small digital recorder. "I have Neka's confession on this recording. She recorded it for her own records, to be used if she ever had the courage to go to the police. If you don't pay, I'll leak it. The Adeleke name will be dragged through the mud, and your wife will be known as the sister of a fraud." Tunde looked at the recorder, then at Simi. He saw the devastation in her eyes, the realization that her sister's love was entangled with a dark, terrible guilt. "You're a small man, Kunle," Tunde said, his voice dangerously low. "You think you can dismantle a family with a recording?" "I think I can get rich," Kunle countered. But as Kunle reached for the briefcase Tunde had brought, a second car pulled up, its headlights blinding them. Out stepped Chief Mrs. Victoria Adeleke, Tunde's mother. She didn't look surprised. She looked bored. "I told you, Tunde. I told you that girl would bring nothing but the filth of the past into this house, but even I didn't realize how deep the filth went." The plot had thickened. It wasn't just a driver looking for a payday. Tunde's own mother had been watching from the sidelines, and she looked ready to end the Adeleke marriage once and for all.
The wind off the Atlantic felt like a cold blade. Tunde stood between his mother, his blackmailer, and his wife, feeling the foundation of his life shifting. The floodlights of the construction site cast long, distorted shadows that looked like giants battling on the concrete. "Mother, what are you doing here?" Tunde asked, his voice strained. Victoria Adeleke stepped into the light, her face a mask of cold elegance. "I am doing what a mother does, Tunde. I am cleaning up the mess you were too blinded by sentiment to see. I've known about Kunle's evidence for 3 days. He came to me first, thinking I would pay to keep the Adeleke name clean." Kunle shifted uncomfortably, clutching the digital recorder. I thought you'd want to protect the family legacy, Ma. The legacy isn't protected by paying rats, Victoria snapped. She turned her gaze to Simi, who looked smaller than ever under the harsh lights. And it certainly isn't protected by harboring the sister of a woman whose career was built on the ashes of her own parents. Do you see now, Tunde? Nneka wasn't a saint. She was a woman drowning in guilt, and she used you as a life raft for her sister. Simi stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. She didn't choose the life she was given, ma'am. She was 10 years old. If someone took her in, she did what she had to do to survive. Everything she achieved, her law degree, her reputation, she worked for that. She didn't set the fire. But she kept the secret, Victoria countered. She lived a lie while you were scrubbing floors, and now she has tethered her lie to my son. Tunde looked at the briefcase in his hand, filled with the down payment Kunle had demanded. Then he looked at Simi. He remembered the letters Nneka had left behind. He realized now why the letters felt so desperate, so heavy with unspoken sorrow. Nneka hadn't just been dying of cancer, she had been dying of the truth. Give me the recorder, Kunle, Tunde said quietly. The money first, Kunle insisted, his greed overcoming his fear of Victoria. Tunde walked toward him, but he didn't hand over the briefcase. Instead, he grabbed Kunle by the collar of his jacket. You have been in my house for 8 years. You saw Nneka suffer. You saw her waste away to nothing, and you decided that her pain was your pension plan? Tunde, stop! Victoria shouted. Just pay him and let me handle the girl. We can have the annulment annulled. We'll tell the world Simi was a distant relative who has moved abroad. Tunde ignored his mother. He looked Kunle in the eye. If you leak this, you go down too. Extortion carries a heavy sentence, and I have the best legal team in the country. You'll be in a cell before the first blog post goes live. But if you give me that recorder now, you walk away with nothing but your life. No money, no job, just the chance to leave this city before I change my mind. Kunle looked at Tunde's face and saw a man who had moved past grief into a cold architectural fury. He looked at Victoria, who offered him no support. With a shaky hand, he dropped the recorder onto the concrete floor and brought his heavy leather boot down on it. Crunch! He did it again, grinding the plastic and circuitry into the dust until it was nothing but gray powder and jagged shards. Now, Victoria said, smoothing her lace wrapper, I will see that it's destroyed, and we can begin the process of removing this girl from our lives. I've already spoken to a lawyer about the annulment. It will be as if she never existed. Simi lowered her head. She began to walk towards the exit, her heart breaking for the second time. She didn't blame Tunde. How could he stay with her now? She was a walking reminder of a conspiracy that had stained his perfect life. Simi, wait, Tunde called. She stopped, but didn't turn around. Tunde looked at his mother. You're right, Mother. This record could destroy the Adeleke name. It could reveal that my wife, my late wife, was the daughter of a tragedy she didn't disclose. Exactly, Victoria said, reaching for the device. Give it here. Tunde's fingers tightened around the recorder. But you're wrong about one thing, Mother. Simi isn't the filth of the past. She is the only honest thing left in this story. Nneka gave her to me because she knew I needed to be reminded that life isn't about status or legacies. It's about who stays when the fire starts. Before Victoria could react, Tunde dropped the recorder onto the concrete floor and brought his heavy leather boot down on it. Crunch! He did it again, grinding the plastic and circuitry into the dust until it was nothing but gray powder and jagged shards. "The evidence is gone, and so is your leverage, Mother," Tunde said. "And so is your leverage, Mother." "You fool!" Victoria gasped. "You've tied yourself to a nobody, a maid with a past." "I've tied myself to my wife," Tunde corrected. He walked over to Simi and took her hand. Her fingers were ice cold, but she didn't pull away. "Let's go home, Simi." "You think this is over?" Victoria screamed as they walked towards the car. "The truth always finds a way out. You can't bury the dead twice." As they drove away from the construction site, the silence in the car wasn't the heavy, awkward silence of their first months. It was the silence of two people who had just walked through a storm and were surprised to find they were still standing. "Why did you do that?" Simi whispered, looking at the city lights reflecting in the window. "You could have had your old life back. You could have been free of all of this." "I don't want my old life," Tunde said, keeping his eyes on the road. "My old life was built on things I didn't understand. I want a life where I know exactly who is sitting across from me at the dinner table, even if that person has a secret or two." But as they pulled into the mansion's driveway, they saw a sight that made Tunde slam on the brakes. The front door was open wide, and the lights were blazing. Standing on the porch was Mr. Bankley, the lawyer, and beside him was a woman who looked strikingly like Nneka, only older, grayer, and very much alive. Simi gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Auntie!" The past hadn't just found a way out, it had arrived on their doorstep. The woman standing on the porch looked as though she had been carved from the same wood as Nneka. She had the same high cheekbones and the same piercing, intelligent gaze, though her face was etched with the weariness of many hard years. Simi scrambled out of the car before Tunde had even fully turned off the engine. "Auntie Toyin?" Simi's voice was a ragged whisper. The woman stepped forward, her eyes brimming with tears. "Simi Sola, my little bird." They collapsed into an embrace that seemed to bridge 20 years of silence. Tunde followed slowly, his mind reeling. He looked at Mr. Bankole, who stood by the pillars of the porch, his face unreadable. "Bankole, what is this?" Tunde asked. "Who is she?" "This," Bankole said, gesturing to the woman, "is Toyin Williams. She is Nneka and Simi's maternal aunt, the woman everyone, including Nneka, thought had perished in the aftermath of the fire." Inside the house, the atmosphere was electric. They gathered in the living room, but no one sat down. Toyin looked around at the luxury of the Adeleke home with a mixture of awe and bitterness. "I wasn't in the fire," Toyin began, her voice steady. "I was away in the village when it happened. When I returned to Lagos, the building was a blackened shell. I was told the children were gone. I was a poor woman, Tunde. I had no power to fight the official reports. I spent years searching, but the records had been wiped clean by the man who took Nneka." "Chief Adeyemi," Tunde said, naming Nneka's adoptive father. "He was a philanthropist, a pillar of the community." "He was a thief of souls," Toyin spat. "He didn't adopt Nneka out of the goodness of his heart. He took her because he knew she was the only witness who could identify the men who set the fire. He kept her close to keep her quiet. He educated her, yes, but he also shackled her with a debt of gratitude that she could never pay. He told her I was dead. He told her Simi was dead." Simi sat on the sofa, her hand tightly clutched in Tunde's. "But Nneka found me. She knew I was alive." "She found out the truth only after Adeyemi died. She found his private journals. That was when she realized her whole life was a gilded cage. She spent her final years frantically trying to undo the damage.
She found me in a small town in the north, living under a different name. She sent me away, told me to stay hidden until she could set the board for your safety, Simi." "Set the board," Tunde repeated, the architectural term sounding hollow. She wasn't just marrying us off, she was building a fortress around Simi. "But there is one more thing," Mr. Bankole interrupted, stepping forward with a leather-bound folder. He opened the folder and handed a document to Tunde. It was a deed of transfer, dated only days before Nneka's death. "Nneka didn't just leave you your shares in the law firm, Tunde. She bought the land this house sits on. She bought your father's old company debt through a series of shell corporations. Technically, the Adeleke family fortune doesn't belong to the Adelekes anymore. It belongs to a trust." Tunde's eyes scanned the legal jargon. His breath caught. "And who is the sole beneficiary of the trust?" Bankole looked at Simi. "The woman Nneka spent her life trying to find. Simisola Adeleke." The room went deathly silent. The power dynamic had flipped entirely. The maid didn't just have a seat at the table, she owned the table, the house, and the very ground they stood on. Tunde felt a strange mix of relief and vertigo. He looked at Simi, who looked horrified by the news. "I don't want it," Simi said, standing up. "I don't want the money that came from the fire. I don't want to own my husband." "It's not about ownership, Simi," Toyin said softly. "It's about restitution. Nneka knew that in this world, if you don't have power, people like Victoria will crush you. She gave you the only shield she knew how to build." Just then, the front door slammed. Victoria Adeleke marched back into the house, her face contorted with rage, likely having followed them back to finish her tirade. "I am not done," Victoria screamed, entering the living room. "I will have the police here by morning to investigate the fraudulent." She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes landing on Toyin. She recognized the woman from 20 years ago, the sister of the man her husband had done business with. Her face turned a sickly shade of gray. "You," Victoria whispered. "Yes, Victoria," Toyin said, standing tall. "I remember you, and I remember you standing by while the philanthropist Adeyemi cleared the way for your husband's development projects. You knew about the fire. You knew those girls weren't orphans." Victoria backed away, her bravado crumbling. She looked at Tunde, then at the legal documents in Bankole's hand. She realized that the servant she had despised was now the only thing standing between her and total ruin. "Tunde," Victoria stammered, her voice suddenly small. You are an Adeleke." Tunde looked at his mother, then at Simi, and finally at the aunt who had returned from the dead. He felt the weight of decades of lies finally lifting. "I am an Adeleke," Tunde said, his voice cold and clear. "But this house belongs to Simi, and if you ever speak a word against her again, or if you ever try to weaponize the past, you will find yourself as homeless as she was when Nneka found her." Victoria looked around the room, seeing only enemies. Without a word, she turned and fled the house, the sound of her heels a fading echo of a dying era. Tunde turned to Simi. The storm had passed, but the landscape was forever changed. "What do we do now?" he asked. Simi looked at her aunt, then at the man she had married out of a dead woman's wish. "We stop living in Nneka's script," she said. "We start writing our own." But as the sun began to peek over the Lagos horizon, Simi noticed a small, unmarked envelope that had fallen out of Toyin's bag. On it, in Nneka's handwriting, were 3 words that sent a final chill down her spine. The third sister. The morning sun rose over Lagos, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. Inside the Adeleke mansion, the air felt thin,
as if the house itself were gasping for breath after the revelations of the night. Tunde watched Simi pick up the small, unmarked envelope that had fallen from Toyin's bag. "The third sister," Simi whispered, the words trembling on her lips. She looked at Toyin. "Auntie, what is this? There were only 2 of us, a mupper and I. There was no one else." Toyin's face, which had been a mask of triumph just moments before, suddenly collapsed into a profound sorrow. She sat down heavily on the velvet sofa, her hands shaking. Mr. Bankole turned away, staring out the window at the manicured lawn. He had known this part of the story too. "Nneka couldn't tell you," Toyin said, her voice barely a murmur. "She was afraid that if you knew the whole truth, you would never be able to look at her or yourself the same way again." Tunde stepped closer, his hand resting on the back of the sofa. "The fire, it didn't just take their parents, did it?" "The fire was meant to kill everyone," Toyin said. "But your mother was pregnant, Simi. She was 8 months along. In the chaos of the hospital, amidst the smoke and the screams, she went into labor. She died on the operating table, but the baby, a girl, survived." Simi felt the world tilt. "A third sister? Where is she? Why didn't Nneka find her?" "She did find her," Bankole said, turning back to the room. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a final set of photographs. They weren't old or faded. They were recent digital prints of a young girl, perhaps 19 years old, with a bright, gap-toothed smile and eyes that were unmistakably the same shape of Nneka's. "Her name is Ife," Bankole continued. "When the philanthropist Adeyemi realized there was a 3rd child, he panicked. 2 girls were a burden, 3 were a paper trail. He arranged for the infant to be whisked away to an orphanage in a different state, under a false name. Nneka only discovered Ife's existence in the final months of her life, while she was already undergoing chemotherapy." Tunde looked at the photos. "Is she safe?" "She is a student at the University of Lagos," Toyin said, a small, sad smile appearing on her face. "Nneka had been anonymously paying her tuition for 2 years. She wanted to bring her into the fold, but she ran out of time. She didn't want to overwhelm you, Simi. She wanted you to have a husband and a home first, a foundation, before she burdened you with a younger sister who has no idea who she really is." Simi looked at Tunde. The weight of the Adeleke fortune, the house, and the name suddenly felt different. It wasn't just a shield anymore. It was a resource. "This is why she did it," Simi realized, her tears finally falling freely. "She didn't just marry me to you for my sake. She did it so that when the time came, there would be a family waiting for Ife, a brother-in-law, a sister, a home where she wouldn't be the help or a charity case." Tunde felt a wave of humility wash over him. He had spent months thinking he was the victim of a dying woman's manipulation, but Nneka had been playing a game of such immense love and foresight that it humbled his architectural mind. She hadn't just built a house, she had built a future. "We go to find her," Tunde said, his voice firm. "Today." The meeting happened a week later at a quiet cafe overlooking the lagoon. There were no lawyers, no blackmailer, and no Victoria Adeleke. There was only Tunde, Simi, and a confused, beautiful young girl named Ife, who couldn't understand why the famous architect and his wife wanted to have lunch with a scholarship student. When Simi reached across the table and showed Ife the scorched teddy bear,
and then the matching crescent moon birthmark on the back of her own neck, the world seemed to stop spinning. The truth didn't come out in a roar. It came in a soft, sobbing embrace between three people who were no longer alone. 1 year later. The Adeleke mansion was no longer a museum of silence. The scent of lilies had been replaced by the aroma of spices and the sound of laughter. Ife lived in the West Wing, her textbooks scattered across the Italian marble floors. Toyin had moved into a garden suite, finally finding the peace she had been denied for 20 decades. Tunde stood on the balcony, watching Simi in the garden below. She wasn't dusting or cleaning. She was painting, a hobby Nneka had mentioned in one of her letters. She looked up and caught his eye, blowing him a kiss that was full of genuine, unburdened affection. They stayed married not out of a promise to a dead woman, but out of a choice made every single day. The scandal Victoria had threatened never came. The blood money had been quietly liquidated and donated to a foundation for fire victims and foster children, leaving Tunde and Simi with enough to live comfortably, but not so much that it choked them. Tunde went back into his study. On his desk sat a framed photo of Nneka. She was smiling, her eyes bright and sharp. He reached out and touched the glass. "You win, Nneka," he whispered with a smile. He walked downstairs to join his wife and his sisters. The secret was out, the debt was paid, and for the first time in their lives, the Williams sisters were no longer running from the fire. They were finally home.